Hi, my name is Tom Hancock, and I'm the Executive Director for GEDSA. I'm delighted to have you join today to listen to this very important patient safety initiative. So I'm going to jump in, and Deborah did a great job, if you've seen that video, of talking about why we're looking at addressing this issue of tubing misconnections, and I'm going to focus a bit more on just how we approached and arrived at a solution, and then talk about the solution and how you should think about implementing that solution. GEDSA's mission is to promote initiatives surrounding safe and optimal delivery of enteral feeding and connectivity. GEDSA's members, it is a global effort, and so you will see a number of names on this slide that are very familiar to you, and others that may not be so familiar, and that is to underscore the importance of this initiative and the fact it is truly global. And that's, it's also a good indication of just how many manufacturers, suppliers, component suppliers that are actively involved and engaged in this effort. In addition to GEDSA's members, we have a group of supporting organizations, associations, and practice groups that are very engaged in this effort and want to see a safer tomorrow. We have many organizations that are involved that are supportive of various clinical groups and actually patient safety and advocacy groups as well. And we're delighted to have AHRMM as one very active participant and supporting organization. So ineffective attempts were created over years ago when we realized how big an issue tubing misconnections actually was. And in fact, it reached a level where a comprehensive solution was demanded by the World Health Organization. And they noted that this was a global public health issue and requested the ISO, or the International Organization for Standardization, for an industry standard. Around the same time period, the Joint Commission issued a Sentinel alert in 2006 calling for initiative from the ISO standards group, California legislation, as well as the public outcry for change. So in an ISO process, it's quite common to see a truly global effort, individuals from around the globe that are technical experts, clinical experts, as well as regulatory and standards experts, all convening together to find a safer solution. And the standard that was created was the ISO 80369 small bore connector standard. And in fact, that standard is actually a series of connector standards. These are design standards, and the way I describe that is this is a series of standards that have connectors within each therapeutic area that are designated for that specific area. And I call this kind of swim lanes here. So in fact, you see respiratory has its own swim lane, and that is 80369-2. Enteral, which we'll talk about in great detail today, is the -3. There's limb cuff, which is -5, neuraxial -6, and -7 is intravascular. Today, that is designated, the designated spot for the lure lock, which is a connector that's commonly used across all of these therapeutic areas today, and in the future it will be designated specifically for intravascular or hypodermic applications. The requirements are that they're not connectable with others in the series, rigid or semi-rigid material. It passes a misconnection, risk analysis, usability, human factors testing all at the same time, and that is not connectable with lures or needleless connector ports. When the design was identified, and there were actually a series of designs that were considered several years ago, they all went through a significant amount of testing and validation work to define what that enteral standard was going to look like and ensure that it was compatible and meets with common practice today. So in fact, there was work done with clinical assessments, usability and human factors, misconnection assessments, syringe accuracy reports, user surveys, acceptability and suitability studies. And then in fact, another significant piece of information is that this reverse orientation, very similar to the connector that I'll describe here in a minute, was used in the United Kingdom, and it was actually a reverse lure lock system, and it really helped pave the way for the design that we are proposing and using today. So the design standard for system-specific applications does in fact start with Enteral. This is the first in that series of standards that I mentioned before. EnFit is the trade name for the connector, and that is short for 80369-3. And it really does actually specify the direction of flow of those connectors. And we'll go into that here in a second. So the current system is a male step connector, also known as a Christmas tree connector, that connects directly to the female feeding tube. So this is typically a friction fitment that you put into place and it fits snugly in place. What we're moving to is an EnFit system where on the upper left portion of the yellow circle you'll see the EnFit female connector from the administration set or the syringe that will connect to the male portion of the feeding tube side. Now this fitment is what we consider a forcing function fitment, and it actually locks into place so that you know this connection is supposed to go together. So the challenge that we have is that tubes are often placed in a patient sometimes for months and possibly even years. So to transition the healthcare community and those patients that require enteral feeding, we need to have a transition period, and that includes a transition connector. That connector really allows for what we call backwards compatibility. So you see that same male part that connects to the female EnFit connector on the administration set side that fits in the backwards compatibility into the feeding tube, that female port. And that's going to be used during a period of time, but the goal certainly is to eliminate the long-term need or use of an adapter. What we see for EnFit is an administration set that's going to have a female EnFit connector which has a locking mechanism and what we call a forcing function that connects to the male part on the bottom right corner of this yellow circle. And the administration, this female connector is going to be used for pump sets, gravity feeding sets, as well as other bolus feeding devices. And on the feeding tube side, if it's indicated for use for feeding, enteral feeding, then it requires an EnFit connector, and that would be for an NG tube, a G tube, a low profile extension set, a J tube, and actually PEG tubes as well. So as far as the introduction of EnFit, you may have already seen some of the EnFit product available in market today. Those would be the administration sets with the EnFit female connector and the EnFit transition connector. And some of those were available as early as first quarter of 2015. There was a slight delay in the introduction of EnFit over time, and so the introduction of the EnFit female syringes as well as the EnFit male feeding tubes were not anticipated to be available until this time. AB 444 is a law that was enacted in the state of California that required that hospitals not use products or medical devices that are physically compatible with each other. And they specifically called out IV, enteral, and epidural medical devices. EnFit does address this problem, and with the introduction of EnFit, you can address this California law. There's no other law in the state, in any other state or any other country for that matter, but it is strongly encouraged and suggested. And so GEDSA members will be looking to introduce this across the globe. One incremental piece that's really important to understand is that syringes too will have to be enteral specific. So today you can use a catheter tip, an oral tip, or even a Luer slip tip syringe that's commonly used for multiple purposes. In the future you'll need to have an enteral specific or an EnFit tip syringe for use for administering medication, for flushing, for hydration, as well as for bolus feeding. So, on to a more detailed topic, and many of you who have been following along with the EnFit connector transition and some of the perhaps challenges that were considered many of you have heard about this issue of dose accuracy concerns. These concerns were raised both from a clinician standpoint as well as from an industry standpoint to both understand this very clearly and to identify a safe and proper solution going forward. Clinicians raised concerns on dosing accuracy with small volume doses with an EnFit tip syringe, that traditional female connector that's used in that reverse gender orientation. What they would like to see, and we've learned after talking to numerous pharmacists, nurses, and other clinical staff, is that they want to see dosing accuracy in the plus or minus 10% range as a target for its volumes as very small or little as a 0.2 ml dose when delivered in a 1 ml syringe. Now, it's important to understand from an industry perspective is that there's no current standard, whether it's ISO, AMI, ASTM, or EN, where dosing accuracy requirements are specified for oral or enteral syringes. So in fact, when we looked at this and this demand from clinicians, there really wasn't a good starting point or a standard to look at. So we really, in effect, in this effort, had to create what that standard should look like, looking at all the current uses today. And again, dosing accuracy is not a standard task performed by syringe manufacturers. So it's something that we had to look at when, in fact, there was no baseline data that exists for comparison. So dosing accuracy testing, one of the things we did is we looked at performance testing that was conducted by an independent third-party external test lab. And in fact, they're based in Wales and do work for the NHS England. Syringes with maximum volume of 5 ml and below may require a low-dose tip EnFit connector design to satisfy the dosing accuracy targets. And we'll get into that design here in a second. So GEDSA members, a number of manufacturers actually collaborated to evaluate the following syringes to both identify what that baseline is and then identify with a safer solution, does it meet or beat what's currently in use today. So looking at the proposed EnFit low-dose tip syringe. So the way you would think about this design is, in fact, if you look at the bottom portion of the presentation, you look at the left syringe, and that is actually a Luer lock. It's very commonly used today. And if you see, there's an outer collar and then an interlumen, as we call it, or a male part. Really, what the EnFit low-dose tip does is in many ways mirrors what that design looks like, with an outer collar and then an inner lumen, or inner male part. And so those designs are actually quite similar and serve a very similar purpose actually in the market. The design above actually illustrates that with a green fluid, just for ease of understanding. And basically what you see there is you have a interlumen with a much smaller dead space area that is in and of itself isn't a problem, but when it relates to the EnFit, created problems. And so that is the inner lumen that's filled as well as the green fluid that's actually in the barrel of the syringe. And so that is what the design looks like, and it is a standard EnFit female syringe tip with that interlumen. And the orientation, as mentioned, is a configuration that's very similar to the Luer lock today. So what we did is we looked at this design relative to other oral tip syringes, as well as some of the reverse systems that are available in the market. And what we found was the EnFit low-dose tip delivered a very accurate dose with a dose accuracy with 95% confidence, with a minus 2.9% to a positive 10.47%. So within that error range, the clinicians expected to see a plus or minus 10%. So what you see, in fact, is that the EnFit low-dose tip, that design, actually mirrors quite similarly to what's commonly in use today with the oral tip syringe. Some of the best practices that we learned after doing performance testing as well as usability studies is we found that the removal of the residual fluid in the moat area is really important. What I'm describing here for you is in this moat area, the green fluid that's outside of that interlumen is an area that we want to make sure is kept clean. So under the X, that is not the desirable state. In fact, the picture that's above the check mark, that's what we want to see. So you have fluid inside that interlumen, but not in this moat area right here. So that's the ideal state. The other piece that we want to demonstrate is that we found that method of filling with a syringe is looking at cup fill versus a straw or adapter fill. We found that in all cases, a straw or adapter fill type of a method is going to deliver a more accurate dose than what's also common is a cup fill method. And that's really due to less potential residual fluid that ends up in that moat. And depending on the orientation of the syringe and feeding tube during filling and disconnection, excess fluid may flow. So it is important, again, to reduce that residual fluid towards the syringe, creating a residual fluid on the syringe that can transfer to the feeding tube, as well as into the feeding tube, or fluid may flow back out of the feeding tube. So those are some of the best practices to consider. The low-dose tip EnFit syringe conclusion here is that performance testing results indicated that the dose accuracy was well within the expected range of -2.9 to +10.47, and that's with a 95% confidence interval. This is substantially equivalent to the standard orientation of the male enteral and oral syringes that are very commonly used today. It does perform better than the reverse orientation solutions that are out there with the female tip syringes, and use of an adapter such as a straw provides a better performance than a cup fill. We did misconnection assessment and found that the EnFit low-dose tip syringe mitigates the risk of inadvertent tubing misconnections and provides a clinical benefit that outweighs the risk of its use. We also did usability studies among clinicians around the country and in fact around the globe, and we found that no significant difference versus current practice when filling or administering different viscosity fluids or between respondents. So looking at pharmacists, nurses, and caregivers, we found that no significant differences occurred. We do note, however, that further consideration will need to be given to training and awareness relative to the flicking. So today, it's very common that a clinician will flick to reduce the amount of air bubbles in a syringe. Well, in the future, we're asking to do that same thing, the flicking of the syringe, but not only for the air bubbles, but also to remove that residual fluid in the syringe. So it's important to look at the timing, and it's also important to recognize that this has been delayed before, and those delays were due to the availability of syringes to meet market demand, but also to address this low-dose tip issue that we just mentioned. And so with those two resolved, we do recommend, GEDSA recommends, to proceed forward with the introduction of EnFit along the following timeline. You've seen the introduction of administration sets with the transition connector attached. We're now suggesting in the first half of 2016 that you should expect to see both EnFit tip syringes as well as feeding tubes with the EnFit male connector attached to them. And we would recommend to do that in the first half of 2016 with adequate supply. Now, it is important to note that there is a large supplier out there that is not part of the list that I offered up at the beginning of my session, and that is BD. And BD is a very large supplier of syringes, and they've indicated it in two public letters to their customers that they do not intend to follow the EnFit connector standard. Their latest letter that came out in April indicates that they intend to follow the 80369-3 connector standard, but not the EnFit orientation. That's we've suggested the reverse of the female to the male. So if you're reliant on BD for syringes today, it's strongly advised that you look at alternative suppliers to provide EnFit tip syringes. And there are many of them out there, many of which are members of GEDSA. I want to point you to another communication. Medtronic is one of the many members of GEDSA. And back in the fall, they indicated that they were not certain about their launch timing. Well, more recently, in May, they communicated that they do intend to launch and EnFit solution, feeding set of solutions, so their administration sets, their syringes, as well as their feeding tubes, in the July time period, corresponding with the California deadline. And of course, that's subject to 510(k) clearance of this low-dose tip EnFit syringe. So I wanted to point those two things out to you. Those are two major suppliers. Certainly there are many other suppliers that are members of GEDSA that are supportive of EnFit, and it's important for you to have conversations with those suppliers. As far as our recommendations, I would say work with your enteral feeding device supplier representatives, and be sure to understand their precise timelines and what their offerings are. Discuss their specific EnFit transition timing for enteral tubes and syringes, and verify their ability to meet your demand. And then I would certainly recommend finding a backup plan, just to be safe. As far as the low-dose tip syringes, specifically, we would suggest anything under 6 ml syringes should consider the use of an EnFit low-dose tip syringe. Now, that's, of course, depending on your facility needs. Anything large, 6 ml or larger, should really not need the use of a low-dose tip syringe. And that's really mainly because you wouldn't likely use a large syringe to give a very, very small dose. And then, of course, again, we ask you to verify that your supplier has adequate supply to meet your demand, and not only for your facility, but for your homebound patients at discharge. Lastly, I want to point to the website, stayconnected.org. This is a site that GEDSA maintains, and it's a way for us to communicate to you all exactly what's happening with the latest and greatest information. We have FAQs, we have checklists, we have brochures, we have presentations, and we also have a newsletter that you can certainly sign up for to get monthly updates on what's going on with the EnFit transition. So we very much encourage you to visit that website if you have any questions. And certainly if your questions aren't answered there, you can direct those to info@gedsa.org with any questions that you have relative to EnFit. We thank you very much for your time, and have a pleasant day.
Thanks for listening. For our expanded educational offerings, please go to the full catalog section of the Learn Something website or to www.ahrmm.org.